we all have that question. We're obviously, many of us are maybe people we know, or perhaps even people that we study are Buddhist. And we know that Buddhism has left long roots in the United States, but it's been a very kind of uneven history, especially that history has been represented in books, in the popular discourse. And but recently, especially in the last, I would say, last half century, Buddhism has really flourished in the US. But the question then becomes, where are we going? We've had this long history, especially with this, recent, not so recent, but the boom in Buddhist faith. And where do we go from here? We're seeing kind of new communities of practice emerge, but frankly, we haven't heard much about them. But two books have really changed that, and we're happy to have with us today the authors of both books. So I'm happy to introduce to you Chenxing Han and Drew Baker. And Chenxing is the author of Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists. She's a Bay Area-based writer whose publications have appeared in Buddha Dharma, Journal of Global Buddhism, Lion's Roar, Pacific World, Tricycle, and elsewhere. She holds a bachelor's degree from Stanford University and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union. After studying chaplaincy at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, she worked in spiritual care at a nearby community hospital in Oakland. Her first book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, was published by North Atlantic Books in January 2021. Also very pleased to have here Drew Baker, who is the author of Converting American Buddhism, Second Generation Buddhist Americans, Orientalism, and the Politics of Family Religion. Drew is the managing director of the Digital Theological Library. He is a white second generation Buddhist from Boise, Idaho, where he is right currently. In addition to his first book with Claremont Press, he has published in Decolonial Horizons, the Journal of Law and Religion, Theological Librarianship, and other locations. He holds a PhD in Religious Studies from Claremont School of Theology and a Master's of Library Science from San Jose State University. And I should mention that, Drew both took classes here when he was a doctoral student, but also was an instructor in the Religious Studies Department here at University of the West. So welcome, Chenxing and Drew. As I was speaking before we started the event, I know both the work that both of you have done, and I was really excited to put you in conversation with one another. But before that, so we can acquaint our audience with your contributions, we are going to, have each of you speak briefly on your book and just give us a little kind of entree into the publication. So we'll start with you, Chenxing.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you to Fong for helping design a beautiful poster for this event. Thank you, of course, Drew, for being in conversation with me. It's really exciting to just be in conversation with another author writing about American Buddhism. And of course, thank you all of you who are here today. I apologize to those of you who have already read the book, so if what I'm going to say is a little bit redundant, or for those of you who attended my conversation with Jane last month at Stanford. So I just wanted to give a little overview for those of you who aren't so familiar with the book. So back in when I read the Pew Forum statistics in 2012 about how 2/3 of American Buddhism are of Asian heritage, I just remember this moment of thinking, there's this dissonance, right, between the mainstream representations of American Buddhism, predominantly white voices, and the lack of Asian perspectives. And I was also at this time, thinking about my own experiences. So visiting Cambodian or Vietnamese or Chinese temples in the Bay Area in college, which is when I really started exploring Buddhism more, and realizing like these are places where I mostly saw grandmas or grandkids, not so many young adults, and then going to predominantly white convert Buddhist communities in, Vipassana and in Zen traditions, really seeing very few people under the age of 50 and very few people of color, much less Asian American Buddhists. And this is, about 15 years ago. So I think things are slowly starting to change, but it just brought up this question of, where are all the young adult Asian American Buddhists? And even I think going to some retreats specifically for people of color, for BIPOC, not even necessarily finding a lot of Asian Americans there. So it just kind of brought up this question of where they were. And I really appreciate Drew's book for, pointing out how just age is a factor that we so often neglect in religious studies broadly, but especially within Buddhist studies. And I think for me, deciding to do research on young adults was kind of just pragmatic. I thought I really wanted to understand Asian American Buddhists as a pan-Asian category, including South, Southeast, East Asians, right? Maybe even people who trace their heritage to Central or West Asia. I mean, Asia is a huge geographic continent. And I felt like Asian Americans are talked about in this kind of lumped sort of way, but I couldn't possibly learn all of the languages of the Asian diasporas and interview everyone. And so interviewing young adults was both kind of a personally meaningful, but also just like linguistically pragmatic in the sense that I did my interviews, primarily in English. Of course, some people might drop in words from different languages, but that was sort of a requisite for doing my interviews. And so I ended up um, trying to, let's see how to put all the little pieces together. I started a master's program at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, a member so of the Graduate Theological Union, and I was searching for a master's thesis, and it sort of was under my nose this whole time. Oh, why not try to interview young adult Asian American Buddhists and really just try to learn more about their experiences. And I really didn't expect anyone to even want to talk to me or to even find anyone. So when I did this call for interviewees, I tried to be really broad. I said, like, okay, young adult. I mean, if you feel like a young adult, 20s, 30s, maybe you're a young at heart 40-year-old, just come talk to me. If you're Asian American, and by that, I don't just mean East Asians like we sometimes think about in the popular media. I mean, like anyone with full or partial heritage, if you're mixed ethnicity or mixed race Asian American, I still welcome you to talk with me. And you also don't have to go around saying I'm a Buddhist to everyone. Like just if you have some connection to Buddhism, somehow it's meaningful to your life. And I'm really glad actually I made such broad parameters because it kind of gave me an opportunity to really explore sort of the possibilities and also the limits of this constructed category, Asian American Buddhist, kind of a category that I think, Jane, you put it this way, that it's a category still in the making. And so we kind of got to explore that category together through our interviews. So I did 26 interviews in person, primarily here in the Bay Area, but also 4 down in Southern California, which is just really a delightful experience to be down there. And I got to visit US as, part of one of my trips down there. Um, so yeah, so this book kind of, I would say, came as a response to sort of my own loneliness and my own confusion, my loneliness as an Asian American Buddhist, someone who was not raised Buddhist, but came to it later in life, and just wanting to understand more about the diversity and the complexity of what it meant to be Asian American Buddhist. And I sort of, it's kind of impossible to talk about my book without mentioning Aaron Lee. I have a photo of him here, who started the Angry Asian Buddhist blog back in 2009 and who sadly passed away of cancer in 2017. But from that, almost decade that he was writing about issues of race and representation and power and privilege in American Buddhism, he really opened the eyes of so many of us to thinking about these issues in American Buddhist context, to not just seeing these issues as kind of irrelevant or purely illusory, but understanding, I think, ahead of his time, that these are really important issues that we need to think about. And they're, very much, I think, at the forefront of our consciousness now, which I often think, what would kind of feels like Aaron's still with us right now, just sort of smiling and cheering us on as we continue to open up spaces for these kinds of conversations. So I haven't been looking at the time. I hope I'm not taking up too much time, and I want to leave plenty of time for us all to discuss and answer questions. So I guess I'll just say that the book itself, I mentioned the 26 in-person interviews, and I subsequently did an additional 63 email interviews because just so many people wanted to talk about these topics. So in total, I interviewed 89 young adult Asian American Buddhists from a really wide range of backgrounds. And when I was grappling with how do I organize all of this into book form, it was actually Noel Alumet, of an alum of UWest's chaplaincy program, who gave me the idea for how to structure his book. So in his interview, he talked about himself as a first-gen American Buddhist, so the first generation of his family to be Buddhist in America since he was raised Catholic. And he talked about his, many friends in the LA area being second gen Buddhists in the sense that their parents were Buddhists and had raised them in this country. And then he also talked about his multi-gen Buddhist friends. So especially, our Shin Buddhist friends, our Japanese American who are fourth or fifth generation American Buddhist in this country. And so my book is actually structured that way. Part one looks at my interviewees who are multi-gen Shin Buddhists. Part two looks at second gen Buddhists from, Taiwanese, Chinese, Laotian, Tibetan, Sri Lankan, a wide range of ethnic backgrounds, Burmese, etc. And then the third part looks at sort of first gen or convert Asian American Buddhists. And the reason I put those all in scare quotes is a lot of my interviews in that category didn't necessarily identify as convert because that label is so strongly associated with sort of white convert Buddhists. So a lot of that section is our discussions of, how we relate to this idea of convert. And then finally, part four, which is called Refuge Makers, weaves together the voices in the previous three sections and where it talks about issues of anger, privilege, solidarity. And I'd also say I probably don't have time to read a short excerpt from my book, but for those of you who read it, you know that it's kind of a very hybrid book, that it draws on scholarship, but there's also aspects of memoir. There's also kind of an anthology or ethnographic feel because of so many voices being woven in the memoir. So I think I'll stop there. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear Drew give an overview of his wonderful book.
Thank you, Chenxing. Drew.
Well, thanks so much, Chenxing, for that lovely introduction to your book. And since you showed my book, I'll show yours. I also won't try to take too much time talking a little about introducing my book for those that aren't familiar with it. And I thought in true Buddhist spirit, although I think this story, I've heard this story be used for Jewish communities, Christian communities, Buddhist communities. I think it originated, my understanding is within Jewish communities, but I think it actually is appropriate for Buddhist communities as well, which is if you have 5 Buddhists in a room and you ask them to interpret a text, you'll end up with 10 different interpretations. So I thought in that spirit, I'd give 3 different interpretations of my own book. One sort of the traditional nuts and bolts spin of the book. The second is sort of a personal spin of the book. And then the last is a relational understanding of the book, particularly in connection with Chenxing's book. So my book really at its heart is a mystery. While the children of Buddhist American converts likely outnumber their parents, neither Buddhist practitioners nor academics have really discussed the experience of second generation Buddhists in the United States at all. And my book really begins with a question of why the absence of this ink? Why are second generation Buddhist Americans invisible? I attempt to answer these questions by reconstructing the cultural history of white Buddhist American converts in particular, and their children from the 1950s to the present. I examine a wide range of popular narratives, including Jack Kerouac's novels, parenting manuals, films like Little Buddha, and essays and autobiographies by second generation Buddhist Americans. So unlike Chenxing's book, which is predominantly ethnographic, mine is sort of cultural history, pop culture history. So I argue second generation Buddhist Americans are invisible because they are caught within a global web of racialized representation that is designed to favor particular groups and marginalize others. And building on the work of Dr. Iwamura and Dr. Chia, among others, I call this web of representation the monk-convert lineage. I argue that the racism of that structure is completely inseparable from ageist representations that undergird the authority of the lineage model as well. Conversion, in this case, i.e. converts going under the process of converting to Buddhism, describes a process that is ideally done by a young white adult in order to signify and strengthen the power, freedom, and creativity of these agents as they transform Buddhism for the West. It isn't simply these white adults that undergo conversion, but by projecting authority on Oriental monks only to return that power to themselves, so it's an illusion effectively, these converts seek to remake Buddhism in their own image to the exclusion of others. Their stories again and again tell the tale of the fountain of youth. Coming to Buddhism again and again remakes the converts as youthful, creative, fresh, and new, while they in turn remake Buddhism in their own image. And in one example in my book, I talk about Kerouac and Dharma Bums literally describing himself becoming young again as he journeys up the Matterhorn peak with his mentor, his Buddhist mentor. Within this lineage model, alternate lineages are presented as either dead ends or active threats to the future of Buddhism in the West. Asian and Asian Americans are either represented as infantile masses possessed by their stale traditionalism and culture, or individual mysterious ancient monks in need of new convert students who can save Buddhism from death. And Dr. Iwamura talks about that at length in her wonderful book, Virtual Orientalism. By making themselves the heroes of a new Buddhism, these converts become the present and future of Buddhism, and all other stories, all other bodies, as the representation of those stories, must be marginalized. In addition to Asian Buddhists, Asian American Buddhists, and Buddhists of color more broadly, the children of the converts are inconvenient to the dominance of this structural narrative. Their youth challenges the youth of their convert parents. Their inherited religion challenges the idea of their parents' idea that freely chosen religion is superior. And their existence challenges the idea that there is only one authoritative lineage in Buddhism. Their ability to reflect back the stories and values of their parents exposes the hypocrisy and flaws at the heart of the structure. After fleshing out this cultural history, I consider the stories of many white second-generation Buddhist Americans, not only their marginalization within Buddhism in the West, but the ways they resist their marginalization and work to find voice, community, and visibility within the wider Buddhist landscape. They invoke the authority of their parents against itself, attempting to create space for a new and old Buddhist lineage of parent to child. For all of their differences, their stories show many commonalities: isolation, creativity, resistance, depression, religious marginalization, seeking but struggling to find community, and most of all, looking to their roots in an attempt to articulate a Buddhism that works for them. So that's the first, that's the nuts and bolts. The second is this book was a deeply personal story for me because I myself am a second generation Buddhist. I grew up in a lower middle class white family. I'm a child of Buddhist convert parents. My mother died young though, so my father raised both my brother and I by himself. And my father, ex-Catholic Buddhist convert, was very anxious, like a lot of converts, about indoctrinating my brother and me in a religious tradition. So he tried very hard to keep his religious identity sort of isolated and kept from Dylan, my brother and I. And yet, at the same time, he passed Buddhism on all the same, because we know as Buddhists that we are relational creatures and we influence everything around us and we're influenced by everything around us. So my dad taught me how to meditate when I was a young child. He shared Buddhist stories all the time, Buddhist values, Buddhist sayings. That was his favorite. He would always like say these cryptic, Zen koan sayings, basically. His favorite, of course, being, if you see the Buddha in the road, kill him, right? That he would just share all the time. And that was a big part of my household growing up as a kid. I was bullied a lot as a religious minority as a kid, especially in Idaho, which is a very Christian supremacy dominated space. And my father never really understood that because he had grown up Christian. And I think understanding that, particularly in light of Kyati Joshi's work on white Christian privilege, has helped me really understand that schools in particular are a very strong vehicle for religious marginalization in the United States, and I imagine more broadly as well. And that's often a disconnect between second generation parents and their children, because the parents don't really understand that. I never belonged, nor did my family, to a wider Buddhist community. My dad sort of hopped around a lot, and he never really brought us. Religious education in my household was ad hoc. I was isolated with the exception of a couple friends. I would have not thought that there was anyone out there like me until I was older. And then I studied religion in college and grad school, and this strange, weird new thing, right, that to me, religion, right, which is funny because I grew up in a religious household. But I didn't want to write about Buddhism despite constant advisor encouragement, because that history in that context, there was too much pain, too much isolation, too much suffering. It was really hard to kind of sit into that experience for me. And it was really conversations with childhood Buddhist friends that changed my mind, that I was not alone, and my story was resonant with many others. And we felt religiously invisible and unmoored from the wider and local Buddhist communities, and found some sense of connection together. So I did my research and wrote my book. And in full disclosure, every word was challenging, extremely challenging for me to write. It felt like I was writing in my father's house with my father looking over my shoulder at every word. And yet, meeting and chatting with every second generation Buddhist like me kept me going. I wanted to write a book to speak, at least in part, to our collective suffering, our creativity, and our real place in the complex story of Buddhism, from what came before us, our context today, and the futures before us. And then my third spin is then I read Chenxing's wonderful book, and my mind exploded, because in addition to all of the other amazing things her book taught me, it helped me recognize that there is another way of really understanding my book. In her book, I saw stories that were not my own, or the stories of any white second generation Buddhist Americans, stories of creative resistance and meaning caught within violent Orientalist material and cultural structures that will never marginalize me or folks like me in the same quantity or quality. I was also surprised, though, to see so much resonance. The isolation, the invisibility, the struggle to fit in, the desire to find others like us, ultimately the struggle to figure out what to do with what we had been given, our inheritance, whatever and however different that might be for all of us. And I was struck by a passage in her book that felt like it neatly summarized everything I had attempted to do with my book. And this is from page 247. Some may dismiss us as mere cultural Buddhists, Chenxing says, but we know that all Buddhists are cultural Buddhists. All of us have inherited cultural roots. All of us are being shaped by and are always shaping the cultures we live in. I couldn't have said it better. And similarly, my book is a story of inheritance and cultures. One culture that attempts to present itself as unique, special, the sole true inheritor of our Buddhist forebears. This culture even attempts to present itself as timeless and beyond culture, but ultimately it is still culture. But culture is not a limitation, it is a gift. We cannot leave our roots behind, we cannot make a radical break with our ancestors, and we cannot attempt to escape our history in order to insist on our freedom and power. By trying to do so, white converts not only marginalize the diverse lineages of Buddhism, marginalize so many others, they also fool themselves into thinking that at least this kind of modernity and the white modern heroes that serve as its vanguard have escaped the nature of what it means to be human. My book argues that white Buddhist converts would do well to learn from Asian and Asian American Buddhists, and to a lesser extent their own children, like so many times before, and see they are simply one stream in a wide and diverse river system. What came before them, whom they owe, and what is in front of them. But the book isn't really about them, even as it asks these questions of the past and present, as it is really about second generation Buddhist Americans wrestling with their inheritance. I, like so many Buddhists before me, am really asking just two questions in my book. What have I and my community been given? And what can we do with that gift?
Great, thank you, Drew. Thank you both for the introductions to your book and those perspectives. And so the way I wanted to proceed is just to ask you a couple of questions that cut across both books. And then we'll open it up to you and then finally to the audience too. I feel that I must talk about the two Buddhisms typology or model, because that seemed to compel your projects, basically, both your projects. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the two Buddhisms typology, I'll just neatly summarize this up with Chenxing's words here. The dominant story of Buddhism in America is that there are two Buddhisms, the Buddhism of white converts and the Buddhism of Asian immigrants. What differentiates two distinct and mutually isolated brands of Buddhism, one may ask? We are told, for starters, that Western white Buddhists focus on meditation practice in keeping with their rational, modernist bent, whereas Asian American Buddhists prefer the traditional and devotional rituals of chanting and bowing. And I think what both of your books try to address, and here I'm going to quote from you, Drew, is that the racialized tradition following tradition breaking binary minimizes the diversity of both sides of the typology. And so what both your books try to do is, really kind of blow that typology apart in order to show the diversity within American Buddhism. So I'm going to, and I also just want to add on a little here, because we received a question in the chat. What is the age range here? That means NextGen Buddhism, which is a great question. And maybe that'll come into the conversation as well. And my understanding, and both of you can elaborate too, is that there was a period where this, this kind of nomenclature of American Buddhism really took root, right? And so it was mainly from about, I would say, the 1970s forward. There wasn't such a thing as American Buddhism, I would argue, before that. And what you do, Drew, in your book is, what I really like is that you show that this actually goes back much earlier, right, to Alan Watts, and that's carried forward by various people, and especially the most notorious, I think, is Helen Tworkoff in her tricycle article. And it's also been criticized and critically looked at by a number of scholars as well. But if you don't have that, you can have the typology, you can criticize it, but then, what's out there, right? And I believe that both of your books demonstrate what is out there by, and I'm just going to share a screen here, looking at the next generation. And the next generation, both of you draw on Sumi Lunan Kim's book, which is Blue Jean Buddha, that talks about young Buddhists. And so I looked at her definition, and she was saying experience of young people from their late teens to early 30s who embrace Buddhism. And I know, Chenxing, you said, they can go to their 40s, right? But, mainly from that, if we look at that generation that emerged or that was present, that constituted American Buddhism at that time, and you look at what potentially is next gen, I think that's where we're at. So I've thrown out a lot here. Please feel free to address. So Chenxing, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I want to thank Wen for this question, because I think I explore in my book kind of generation, right? I think when it's applied to Asian Americans, we often think of just like immigrant generation, first, second, third, or it can get more complicated, 1.5, 1.75. Like I might identify as someone who was born in China, but came to this country and I was 4. And so even just to be able to twist that and have it be like, what generation American Buddhist are you? And in that, there's also a claim that Asian Americans are Americans. American does not just equal white, even though there's often that slippage when we see that word used. And then I think, thirdly, there is also a sort of generation like Gen X, millennial, right? Gen Z. Like, I think who's the next gen? In a way, it's always changing. There's always going to be a new next gen. I think there's always going to be a need for these projects. You know, already I want like a book on Gen Z Buddhists and what they're thinking. And I think that generation is much more racially diverse. And I think there are going to be a lot of different interesting trends. And so there is something about two Buddhisms that just, it's strange that it's kind of very frozen in time. And if all we get is this binary, there's a way in which it's almost like it's Asian immigrants all the way down and it's white converts all the way down. And I think your book does a brilliant job of just pointing out, but second gen white convert Buddhists inherit their Buddhism. So already that it's just like the typology can't hold over time. And I think our books show that quite clearly, I think just on the ground. And I think that it's also interesting, so much ink has been spilled over this typology. And I think many of its logics operate in people's lives, but people might not necessarily be able to name there are two Buddhisms. And one of my favorite questions to ask my interviewees was just, if you had to think of types of Buddhism in America, like what types? And some people were just like, no type, what does this question mean? And like a few people, like US people who'd taken classes, are like, okay, yeah, I know there's this two Buddhism thing, but it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, what about Asian American converts? What about our Black and Latinx and Native American Buddhist friends, or mixed race Buddhists? Like, it just, you know, it's flattening for Asian Americans, it's flattening for white Buddhists, these sorts of stereotypes or these received narratives. So more and more, I think people could see it's kind of like this myth of two Buddhisms that continues to be strong and shape people's lives, I think, in very real ways. But to me, it's like a question of what are alternatives to this myth? What kind of new stories do we tell? And I see both of our books trying to tell some of these new stories so that we can get out of the purview of this really uncomfortable and weird binary box that's been imposed upon us.
True.
Yeah, thanks, Chenxing. And I would echo a lot of what you said. First, with your wonderful question, when I just wanted to say, sort of my 2 cents is, maybe I'm saying this as a historian, but I would actually, I kind of want to try to get away from talking about sort of what is the next generation as a group of people, and more talk about generations as like historical periods. Because a lot of what I talk in my book is, I think, age and youth is power, especially in American society, and who we represent is young or still young is really problematic in a lot of the ways. To the point where, you know, in my book, I talk about a lot of stories where convert parents are presenting themselves as younger than their children, which is really bizarre. So I think rather than talking about, like, you know, sort of the new youth being the next generation, talking about sort of what's the next generation of Buddhism writ large, of old and young and everyone in between, right? That's sort of how I would want to try to, I guess, rethink sort of the question of generations. To the question of two Buddhisms, what I think of is, you know, I'm a teacher at heart, so oftentimes I teach sort of intro theories to religion. And Max Weber, famous sociologist of religion, talked a lot about typologies. And he said sort of what typologies at their heart, they're not trying to reflect truth, because a typology can't really encompass all of truth. Truth is complex. What a typology is trying to do is it's trying to illuminate something that we haven't seen before. And the extent that it does that, it's successful. But recognizing that anytime you shine a light somewhere, you're probably taking a light somewhere else, you know, off something else. So you have to raise that sort of question of who are we shining the light on and who are we not? So much like Chenxing shared as well, I think the sort of origins of the two Buddhism story and its continued existence predominantly shines a light on white converts and their importance in the overall history of Buddhism. And to that degree, and then conceals everyone else. And to the degree it's functioning like that, I think it's extremely problematic. But I would say, to Weber's sort of pragmatism, that I do sort of, in observationally kind of watching over the past 20 years since, I mean, it's actually been longer than that, 30 years almost, since Tworkov and Prebisch and whatnot brought this question back up, is that it seems to kind of function like this kind of like Cold War discourse for scholars in the field to talk about race without just talking about race. And there is pragmatic value, I think, somewhat in that extent, that it has started an open conversations about folks talking about race and white supremacy and other stories in Buddhism that the light wasn't being shined on before. But that said, I would say even the pragmatist in me wants to then just say, okay, but let's just talk about race, right? Because that will open questions in diversity of an awareness of the stories and lineages in Buddhism. The last thing I'll just say is that I think the degree that I would want to sort of propose maybe a possible typology that might be helpful for illuminating, right? Because I've just done a bunch of deconstruction now, is I really like the idea of borrowing from Buddhist history of invoking lineages, right? Maybe that's the historian in me again, but thinking about what came before us, what are our roots, and recognizing lineages are never sort of linear, but we can often have multiple distinct ancestors coming from different locations. And I think that will open a lot more space for talking about sort of the diversity in Buddhism without just kind of ending the question at like, we're diverse, okay, end of story, stamp, we're done, right? But it will open the door for talking in a lot more sort of interesting ways, and also kind of relativize the stories that have been presented as sort of like the sole or most important stories in Buddhism. If you start telling about the sort of dependencies of white convert Buddhists in America on Asian American Buddhist communities that pre-existed them, that shifts the story so significantly, right?
Great. Thank you. Oh gosh, I can follow up with so many questions from what you just both said. But I also wanted our audience to get a sense of, well, heck, I'm gonna jump questions here, okay? And while you were speaking, Drew, there's a quote from your book that says, "To what extent is every history of Buddhism in the United States also an exercise in Buddhist theology?" All right. So, and this is what has happened. I think, both of you point this out, but you especially argue this, Drew, that, with what happened with these typologies is, they have this effect, right? They have the power of discourse. So in that sense, I think both of you are very aware of how what you're doing isn't simply, in your case, Chenxing, an ethnography, right? And what you're doing, Drew, is not simply a cultural history, right? Can you talk about that? I mean, Drew, I think you lean toward to the end. You do say, you do kind of point to the more constructive part of the theological side. And Chenxing, I just wrote about your book, and I said, oh, what did I say? I can't remember the first term, but it's something and a manifesto. Because I think you are making declarations here, right, that will guide, Buddhists, or especially Asian American Buddhists, as we go forward. So can you speak to those more kind of constructivist, positivistic aspects of your books?
We can trade off, Chenxing, if that works. So yeah, that's an excellent question, Jane. And there's a lot to, I think, unpack and think through. There's, I guess maybe I would start actually by talking about Chenxing's book. One of the reasons I loved it so much, Chenxing, you shared sort of that it's sort of straddling, or you're writing from sort of, partly an academic perspective, but also this kind of more personal, community focused kind of perspective. And honestly, academia would benefit so much if they wrote more like your book does. It's just so powerfully sort of woven together of theoretical contributions, your own story, and your community's story. And I think it's so radically self-honest in that way that I really wish more academics were when they wrote their pieces. And beyond, I mean, just like, beyond just like oftentimes you'll see like, a paragraph social location statement at the beginning of a book or something like that, but it's really deeply interwoven in the narrative of your book, which I so deeply appreciated. Um, you know, one of the reasons I mentioned that is because I think, I can be very self-critical, but I think I'm being completely forthright when you're, to your question, Jane, about sort of constructive projects. I see Chenxing's book as very deeply constructive in a way that I don't think my book quite is. I think it's gesturing in that particular direction, but Chenxing involves the community she's talking about in a necessary way. I think any constructive project needs to, if it's going to sort of be self-honest, that it goes beyond just the author. And there is that in my book as well. But a lot of my book, I think, I talked about the personal story of my book, wrestling with my father being in the room. So much of my book was just trying to find a way out of this story that I'd been given. And there's a lot of constructive stuff going on there. But I always almost sort of saw it as kind of the first in a two-part book, where the second book might actually be that kind of ethnographic work that Chenxing so wonderfully did with her community. But that said, I don't want to downplay my book in the sense that I do think there's lots of sort of constructive gestures that are going on in my book of what that kind of community project of second generation Buddhists might look like in America, what that kind of conversation would need to be, what a theological exercise would be that would involve their stories, and what do they need, really? I mean, because that's the base question of any kind of theology or any kind of constructive project is, what does this community need? And I think that's what my book sort of leaves on is, this community is, deeply creative, deeply, has its own wisdom, but is deeply isolated, deeply disconnected from the Buddhist community, doesn't feel like it belongs. And the question is really, how can we create stories that will help them feel like they belong in the wider Buddhist cosmos and feel like their lineage still belongs in this greater story, right? What do you think, Chenxing? I'm really curious what you think.
I really hope you write that second book. I felt so much of that passion and that pain in your book, actually. And I think, yeah, it just made me want to learn more about the people and how these really helpful models that you've given us will, play out in people's real lives. I think there's this moment of like, I think you asked this question, like, is there really two Buddhisms, or is there just one Buddhism that's created a duality and the other half is just like this illusory imaginary? Like, that just really hit me. I was like, yes, like it's an imagined other. I often have this feeling of like, I'm tired of being your retrograde foil as an Asian American Buddhist. I'm tired of playing that part, or whatever this, two Buddhisms, half an elephant, like, the elephant in the room being race that we're not talking about, but like I'm just tired of being made something in a story that I or Asian Americans had no voice in, who, we didn't speak in this story. So in that sense, I love your question, Jane, about Asian American theology or Buddhology, as Dr. Richard Payne might say. And it reminds me, when I was writing this book, I did self-consciously think of my book in that sense, but it was so hard to like write that explicitly. And in the end, I decided, I hope the book can just model what I hope to see, which is that I hope it can model and give people like a real felt sense of what it was like to sit with people on the lawn or at my kitchen table with the vegan cookies, and to have this open space for exploration, which I think has to be the ground of our creative new narratives. I was just talking with Holly Hisamoto, another graduate of US chaplaincy program. We'll be speaking together at Oregon State University next month. And we were just talking about how valuable it feels to have those sorts of spaces where we're not trying to fix everything. We're not trying to like have all the answers, but there's just a space of grappling, of wondering, of sitting with the kinds of pain points, and also sitting with, you know, what we're passionate about, just sharing that together. There's something incredibly powerful about that. And in that sense, my book is also really informed by chaplaincy work and a kind of just deep listening, both to what's being said and what's not being said. And it requires a sort of spaciousness or patience, I think, that I hoped that my book could model. And I suppose recently someone was saying this book feels like it's trying to spark conversations, and it very much is. Like, it's not trying to be the final answer to anything. It's really trying to spark conversations precisely like this one.
Wonderful. Before I turn it over to both of you, I'm going to have one more question. And again, it's going to go a little off script from what we previously discussed. But I know in the audience, you know, primarily we have actually monastics who are engaged in, you know, Buddhist communities, right? We also have Buddhist practitioners who are a part of what are traditionally, it's almost oxymoron, traditionally convert communities, right? And they're really grappling. So within these frameworks, especially I think within the Asian American Buddhist communities, sometimes this two Buddhism things like, you know, except for maybe those who, you know, have the racial consciousness. I know some of the people you talk to, Chenxing, you know, have that kind of racial consciousness, but for a lot of Asian American Buddhists, and I would think also, you know, other white Buddhists as well, you know, this two Buddhisms thing, you know, beyond being in tricycle a couple of times is really not their reality, right? They're Buddhist. But that said, race still plays a really important role here, right? In so many ways. I mean, whether, you know, it's the color of your skin, but it also could be the way that Buddhism itself is racialized, like you were talking about, Drew, right? So I'm just wondering, I'm going to ask the big question, but, you know, it seems that one, race is still a very kind of salient consideration. Even though we're trying to see a more holistic picture of American Buddhism. And what would you say to, you know, those teachers who are working with Asian American, well, just Buddhist youth, who are working with Buddhist youth in these various communities? You know, are there directions, are there issues, are there things that they should pay attention to? So I'll leave it to both of you. So if you want to trade off, so I guess we go to Chenxing and then Drew, but we can go either.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's partly just listening to the youth and asking them what's on their minds. But it seems to me, you know, zooming into some college classes and high school classes, what's on people's minds is anti-Asian violence, is Black Lives Matter, is about how those two things connect, is about how they, as Asian American Buddhists, can be part of building racial solidarities, you know. And I remember hearing one high school student as a Vietnamese American Buddhist talking about the kinds of tensions she feels sometimes in her own families, wanting to, from a Buddhist perspective, know how to communicate with some of her elders who might not understand the same histories she does, who aren't living in, you know, who didn't grow up in the same context that she does, where she is being racialized as Asian American. And I think that it's kind of amazing that I think Asian American Buddhism, well, it's only, you know, probably like within Asia, you can't, I mean, this concept of being Asian, I think it's just harder to get at, right? You're just like, oh, I'm Cambodian or I'm Shanghainese or like something very specific, even ethnically specific. But here, for better or worse, because of the ways we're racialized, it sort of creates opportunities for both like intra-Asian connections, but also intra-Buddhist. And so Theravada and Mahayana are people from different sects. I think like those possibilities for connection are there, but the barriers to connection are also there, especially when it comes to barriers of language. And so for younger people, if they have English as a kind of lingua franca, that opens up possibilities, but there's still right, if their parents aren't necessarily taking them to other types of temples or to rallies that are very multiracial, if they can't drive there. I think like just raising these issues, asking them what's on their minds, what they've been reading, and how that affects them, and how we can take a Buddhist approach to these issues, I think is really powerful, and certainly not, trying to dismiss their concerns, because it seems to me, from my kind of limited experience during a pandemic of trying to connect with young people, that these issues are really weighing on their minds and hearts.
True.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Chenxing. I think building on what you were saying, Chenxing, I guess I come back to the words that I quoted from your book about culture, but I think it's true, just as true of race. That, I think we try to sort of dismiss, and by we, I mean white folks, try to dismiss like race, even well-meaning white folks try to dismiss race as sort of not relevant, or let's move past it, right? That's the danger, I think, of just like tossing out, like sometimes I see in the discourse about two Buddhisms, folks that are just like, I'm tired of talking about race. Let's just not talk about this anymore, right? And the lesson I personally learned, not about race, but being a religious minority, is that is, and I think I write this somewhere in my book, is this idea that we can just sort of move beyond these questions of the structures of power is like the prime fantasy of the privileged, right? Because if you're marginalized, you are intimately aware on a day-to-day basis that you are treated differently because of your skin color, because of your religious clothing, because of your gender or sexuality, so on and so forth, right? And that's just a brute fact. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. In Buddhist language, that feels like very much the structures of samsara and suffering. Not the sole account to it, but a significant part of it, at least our time. And so I guess what I would say is, at least speaking for my communities that I'm a part of, and speaking to white Buddhists in particular, is I think we need to have more forthright conversations about race and white supremacy in Buddhist communities. And we can't put all this responsibility and weight only on the people of color in our communities, because that is so much weight and responsibility. And it's so exhausting and tiring. Again, to the degree I can sort of do intersectionality, I can have some empathy because I have the same sort of resonances with my religious identity. I mean, I mentioned teaching and working at a Christian school for 10 years, and being the token Buddhist person in that space, and having to constantly have the conversations about religious privilege, Christian supremacy, and so on. And so it's exhausting, right? So I think there's an important role for white Buddhists in America to both continue and lead conversations when appropriate about race to the next generations, right, of white Buddhists, in concert with Buddhists of color in it as well, because this problem is not going away. Racial marginalization is not going away, and white folks, our identities are built on that privilege. So we're only going to deal with it if we deal with it in a forthright, upfront way. And we need to deal with that in our religious communities. I think of Anne Gleig as doing great work right now on like white supremacy and white, in Buddhist communities in America. And that work needs to be done. Because I think otherwise, I don't think that represents the majority of white Buddhists in America. I think the majority of white Buddhists are just complacent. But what we don't recognize is that complacency actually furthers that systemic structural representation and violence that harms so many Buddhists and otherwise non-Buddhists in the United States and globally.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm going to give both of you an opportunity to ask each other a couple of questions. We already have questions accumulating in the chat, so I also want to leave time for that. But, I'm excited to see you both in conversation. So
I have one.
first year or
I have one
Can I?
question for you, Chenxing, which I'm
Sure.
just deeply curious about. Because again, you're sort of at a, I'm at a privilege because I have the ethnographic work. You haven't got to see my ethnographic work, but one of the themes I've definitely noticed in interviewing, folks from a similar sort of generational age as the folks that in this sort of decade period you interviewed your folks, in your book, is now there's kind of this new pressing question of children of their own among this generation. We were mentioning before this presentation started, I have two children of my own, but many of the folks that I've been interviewing and doing work with also similarly pressing questions. And I've just noticed a lot of just so much, because there's so much like struggle and questions of identity and anxiety over their own identities. And now they have these questions of how do then they interact with their children about this. And whatnot. So I'm just curious if you could reflect a little about that, if you saw any of that. Did any of your interviewees at the time have children? Have you seen that subsequent in sort of further connections? And sort of, do you see resonances with some of the things I was sharing, or sort of what's that experience like? What are folks talking about?
Yeah, it's like, is it too early to talk about the third generation? I kind of want to ask you that question as someone with kids. Yeah, I think maybe what's interesting is I probably cannot give a very satisfying answer to this question, because one thing that might have unified a lot of my interviewees was most of them, like the vast majority, did not have children. One of them talked about young adult as almost feeling like it's less about age and more about place in life, like not necessarily yet having, a stable career, not having a family. I think, there's some monastics in the group, so that would not be, applicable in their sense, in their case for having children. But I do think it's very astute to ask these questions of when one already grapples so much with these, this sort of intersectional marginalization, what that looks like for their children. And I'm thinking even with this rise in anti-Asian violence for Asian Americans who are having children, how to have a kind of talk about staying safe. And I think that's compounded by being Buddhist, because then there's just this other like intersection of being a religious minority. And so I do wonder if these people, if they have children and have more of a shared language or can understand more of the shared struggle, if that might actually be a little bit easier, because especially for the second gen interviewees that I talked with, there could be such a gap culturally and language wise, like completely understandable kind of immigration causing this almost like break within their family. And I think there maybe is a bit more continuity, a bit more understanding of racialization. So I just imagine that there's more of these questions. And I think they're thinking self-consciously, how do I pass on Buddhism to my children, especially if I myself don't feel very strong in these practices or feel maybe a little bit like insecure or kind of an inauthentic Buddhist. And I imagine for the next generation, this touches upon what you were saying just a little bit earlier, but I just really appreciate you just naming the word intersectional. And I think for young people today, and I'm imagining for generations going forward, there's just, I think, such an ability to think in a more nuanced way. Understanding race is never just race. It's tied up with class, gender, sexuality, and religion. And people want to talk about these all together. How do they interact with each other? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but can I actually throw that was one of my many questions I want to ask you, but can I hear your reflections on this? And perhaps also if you can share a bit of your ethnographic data as well, that would be really exciting.
Yeah. So it's an open question, I think, among white second generation Buddhists right now. Because that kind of pain related to the religious identity that I shared about my own identity, and I share a story in my book about me, but I've seen so much resonance in this and other stories. In fact, oftentimes repeated verbatim. Where when I was a kid, I was hanging out with some Christian friends, and they were talking about, they were evangelizing, right? They were sharing Christianity with me. And they asked what I was, and I said I was Buddhist. And my dad said to me, he overheard, And in front of my friends, he said, no, Drew, you're not Buddhist. You're nothing. You can choose when you're older. And for my dad, that was a profoundly like empowering liberatory act, because again, from his frame of mind, he was so worried about indoctrinating us, that he felt like, only adults could sort of freely choose their religion. So he was sort of creating this free space, right, where we weren't controlled by our culture or something like that. But what he didn't recognize was that that was an incredibly disempowering act for me as a child in that moment, where I was trying to claim my identity, and it almost felt ripped from me by someone I saw as a religious authority in that moment, right? And that story has been echoed so many times, and sometimes verbatim, the exact same details with a lot of my ethnographic subjects, where they have parents that basically deny their child's religious identity, and oftentimes socially in wider spaces and so on. So one of the reasons I share that story is that what I've seen among, one commonality I've seen among a lot of white second generation Buddhists is just a significant amount of anxiety and struggle with their religious identity. And that carries forward, speaking to your question, returning to me of the next generation, where I don't think they really know, because oftentimes they haven't even really found communities for themselves that they feel like they belong, because so much of their roots that they were passed on from their parents, oftentimes were like my father. They were hopping around in communities. They didn't have a set community. Even if they did have a set community, it is a community where the children often weren't welcome, right? So they don't necessarily feel welcome in sort of predominantly white convert communities themselves. But they know intimately that, in interview after interview that I've talked with, they know intimately that it really is that community is so important in the passage of religion. And because they know sort of the struggle and trauma they experienced because they didn't really have those communities growing up as children, how important that is. So yeah, it's a really fraught, tense place. In some ways, it's kind of like, I saw sort of resonance or echoes to some degree in a lot of the interviewees you share in your story, almost at an earlier point where it seemed like a lot of the folks that you would sort of talk to said, at earlier points in their religious journey, they were sort of struggling with these questions like, is there anyone out there like me? Is there a community for me? And your book is actually quite heartwarming, I think, for the possibilities potentially maybe for white second generation Buddhists, where a lot of the folks you share, they're either in the process of finding or have found or continue to find communities that work for them, or they're creating communities, right? And I think I've, among several interviews that I've talked to, that kind of desire and sort of struggle, I think, are sort of the two most common factors of like, sort of how are we going to do this, but knowing that there's this need to do something, because now there's children, right? Now there's this question. It's not just about the individual anymore to some degree. Now it's kind of this pressing issue. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of what came to mind anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so curious. Do you think that, second gen white convert Buddhists are starting to, like, when they are trying to form community, do you see that starting to happen? And if so, is it with, other second gen convert Buddhists? Are they from a similar lineage if they did grow up in something very specific, let's say, or is it sort of traversing different lineages, or are they going to spaces that are more BIPOC or Asian American? Are they trying to build kind of racial solidarities in these communities?
So one of the things that I've found really interesting about the folks that I've been talking to is there's a kind of, and this is a Christian word, which I hate, but for a lack of a better term, we'll use it for the moment. There's a kind of ecumenical dimension to this group of folks, in the sense that because they weren't, going to Buddhist communities very regularly, they weren't being brought to these Buddhist communities. What was Buddhist was being passed on by their parents. Oftentimes their parents would sort of go from community to community. Their own Buddhist identities are very sort of like multi-traditional, right? So, one of my interviewees sort of, says, oh yeah, there's some parts of my identity that come very deeply from, Tibetan Vajrayana, traditions. There's also, and yet at the same time, I'll tell stories, I'll tell koans that my parents talked about, and there's Zen koans through and through, right? So there's this kind of like complex multiplicity, which I think in part makes it harder to find a community, because so many Buddhist communities are sort of rooted specifically in a kind of one lineage or another kind of space. There's been some talk, some of them have talked about potentially starting home communities or small local communities, and seeing where that goes. Honestly, funnily enough, and my research is ongoing, but the largest data set that I found actually has found communities and homes in BCA communities. And I think actually because I suspect that BCA communities have sort of, in American spaces, been thinking through the longest about religious education, education of children in their spaces, and sort of the ramifications of that, and how to do that very thoughtfully and intentionally in a way that they themselves, the white second generation Buddhists didn't experience. So that I have found to be a really interesting kind of commonality. Again, I mean, we're speaking in, it's a significant population, although obviously not all or even a majority. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring up, the Buddhist Churches of America and Shin Buddhism, and also this kind of ecumenical dimension, which I kind of see that spirit in a lot of the interviewees in this book as well, and including in a way among Shin Buddhists who are so rooted in their tradition, I think have almost this privilege of a sense of belonging and these deep historical roots and this organization that's really attended to family. It's really fun to do book events there, because it'll be like people will be there like sitting literally next to their mom, and like their grandma will be on the call, and their Dharma school teacher, who they've known since they were 5 years old, will be there. So there's just this like relationality there that is so incredible, that's already built in. But I also see this ecumenicism, among the second gen, and I think especially among the sort of first gen convert, because we didn't grow up with a tradition. And so there's also this exploratory process of where do we go, where do we find a sense of belonging. And anyway, yeah, so what you say, I think there's a lot of resonances between these two communities we're talking about.
I think, well, I just want to get in here because I think what goes across both books is a term actually you have in your book, Drew, which is the Buddhist sympathizer and the nightlight Buddhist, right? So especially this is a lot of the white Buddhist community, who picks up the Dalai Lama book, right? But this also happens in the Asian American community too, because I know that you talk about this, Chenxing, but I've also had students who said, I'm Asian American, but I'm, Christian, but I want to learn about Buddhism, right? And they're learning it at university and through that, through that book. And we have many people coming, I think, through those avenues too. But you're right, when you get to the issue of having children, usually, then it's like you can't just well, I guess you could pass on the book to the kids, but community, becomes, people begin to reevaluate the value of community. So I want to be sure that we got questions from others here. I'm actually going to start from the chat, but if there are those of you with questions, can you raise your hand? So I'm going to go back to the chat here. And Venerable Han, I don't know if you're still with us or you had a great question in the chat. I can read it, but if you're listening, why don't you go ahead and ask it? And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much for the discussion today. So I'm really, like before, like long time ago, I have conversation with Venerable Hemin. I think some of you here know him. He's a white Buddhist, and he's became a monastic. And we're talking about the idea of authority, like the authentic Buddhism. So he told me that it's really hard for him to immerse into Buddhist community because he's not Asian. But for Asian community like us, the Asian monastic, we feel very hard to immerse into American community, like the white community or the black community, our community. So I don't know, like from your book, do you deal with that kind of problem, and do your interviewee talking about it, or they do they have any crisis or any, I don't know, like how is the connection between the idea of authentic Buddhism and the diversity, the community that they grown up with? So that's the meaning of my question. Thank you.
That's a great question, Venerable, and I don't know if I have complete answers, but I will do my best to reflect a little bit on it. I think one of the reasons it's a great question is because there's been great social research, which was surprising to some and probably not too surprising to others, that shows that the sort of likeliest predictor of whether you have a favorable opinion of someone of a particular race, or specifically the research I'm familiar with is other religious tradition, as if you actually know someone of that religious tradition or race, or we could go down the list. And I think those experiences, is specifically in our postmodern era, are often, in some settings, frequently few and far between. And also, I would say, when they do happen, the weight and responsibility ends up falling on the marginalized folks' shoulders, right? So it has to be Asian communities, for instance, that reach out to white communities to make those connections. So it's a pressing issue, absolutely. But I don't know how much the answers, I think, the constructive solutions are always harder, right, than the questions themselves. Sort of where to go forward. I would say, at least among the white convert communities that I'm familiar with, I think they need to do some serious work about making their communities actually more welcoming and inviting, and highlighting stories that are not their own. So that people come into their spaces and actually feel welcome to share their story. They don't feel like they have to conform to the stories or the narratives or the values or the texts. I mean, we could go down the list, right? I think there needs to be a kind of more flexibility and as well as honesty about sort of what white communities owe Asian communities and communities of color, that is happening in some sort of located pockets, but needs to happen in a more sort of deeply systematic way. And I think that might help. I also think, that is one part, but I think another part is, I think white Buddhists also have to become more comfortable in being decentered and being in decentered spaces where they are not the hosts and they are the guests. And they sort of are the listeners. And that is a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, among white communities, so that responsibility isn't put on peoples of color. And then lastly, I would say, just a constant issue that oftentimes comes up in classrooms when I'm talking about histories of Buddhism in the United States, white Buddhists also just need to be okay with that. It's okay for peoples of color, Asian communities, Black communities, etc., to have their own Buddhist communities, and that's okay. Like, they can have their own spaces. It's almost like this level of paranoia where it's like, what's going on behind these walls, right? Like, what's going on? Why aren't we welcome? Or why do we not feel welcome? And it's really this decentering work of saying, we don't need to be the center of every story. White folks do not need to be the center of every story, and we don't need to be in every narrative, and we don't need to be in every community, and that's okay. And and that work needs to be done. It's it's an ongoing project, I would say. It's work. Yeah, it's an ongoing project.
Chenxing?
I'm curious what you think, Chenxing.
Yeah, I think I would just add briefly, I think I'm thinking about these terms that you mentioned, Venerable, about authenticity and diversity. And I think for a lot of my interviewees, they contain the diversity in themselves. They're mixed race, maybe. They're multi-ethnic. In fact, two Buddhisms, one of them said, this is really confusing because I feel like half of me is erased and half of me is present, right? So I think that actually there's a lot of understanding of how, this word authentic, I tend not to use it so much in my writing because it often seems to point at this destination we're trying to reach, some fixed essence. And a lot of my interviewees were just clued into like, but Buddhism teaches not self. There's no permanent fixed self, that things are impermanent, are constantly changing. And in fact, everything is already like multiplicitous and diverse. It's always been strange to me when sort of Asian American temples are seen as like enclaves, as if they're just this one thing. And I'm like, but the Thai temple, let's say that Jie Mingbao writes about in her book, has Thai people and Lao people, and I'm sure there's some Cambodians who go there, and there's people who are married to white people and Black people. It's already very diverse, actually. I mean, maybe it's said that it's not diverse, but anyone who goes there can actually understand. So I actually think some of these questions just get worked out within communities as intermarriage happens, right, across different racial and ethnic groups. And that there's like not necessarily a binary between being authentic, which seems to almost suggest a kind of purity that I think we really can't find or exist. And in fact, I think a lot of purity narratives are quite dangerous, and so I don't see this binary between this authentic, pure, and then diverse. Like the reality is everything is kind of already constructed and diverse and changing and constituted of many different factors.
Yeah, I'd almost just add, Chenxing, to what you just said, is that I had a Jewish history professor once who made a distinction because he was teaching a predominantly Christian class, and he made a distinction where Christians predominantly think about boundary drawing in their communities as about orthodoxy, right belief. So you can practice, you may or may not even go to the community, but if you don't believe in God, you're not Christian, right? It's about belief. And he said Jewish communities sort of think about orthopraxy, right? So whether you belong in the Jewish community or not is often, how do you practice? What are your practice? And belief isn't really central. You can be an atheist Jew, for instance, right? And that's completely normal in that community. And I remember him asking me, Drew, he's like, Drew, how do Buddhist communities, how are they boundary drawing? And I thought about it a little bit, and I said, I think it's not really about orthodoxy or orthopraxy. I think it's about lineages, right? That's the authority, that's the authenticity that comes. And that's not specific to our modern era even. I talk in my book, there have been great scholars of Zen that have talked about the lineages of various monastic traditions that were writing lineages and using them against each other, basically, for their authority within their historical tradition. So I think lineages, I talked before, lineages can be really empowering. It can highlight lots of great stories, lots of diversity. But I do think that there's also work that needs to be done among Buddhist communities. To your question, your point about authenticity, that boundary drawing and that question of who is a real Buddhist, who is a true Buddhist, who's an authentic Buddhist, does a lot of harm. It causes a lot of suffering. On one hand, I really do respect those that are trying to sort of honor the sort of their forebears, the traditions that they've been given. But I think it's quite the balancing act that you're sort of need to recognize that at the same time as recognizing the suffering sometimes that those boundaries that you draw about, I'll speak in terms of white convert communities where they'll say, oh, have you read D.T. Suzuki? And if you say, no, I haven't read D.T. Suzuki, they're like, well, you're not a real Buddhist. And that's just silly, right? And I say that as someone who very deeply admires D.T. Suzuki, but that kind of use of just arbitrarily boundary drawing who's a real Buddhist based on one book you've read, that's just harmful. It is actively creating suffering in a way that I think Buddhists could do better. I think we could do better.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. President Ta, did you want to pose your question? Are you?
Oh, after I posed my question and I listened to Chenxing and Ju, and I was saying like, I agree with lots of things that you say. Is I think this issue is so complex, particularly, and I hope Chenxing books would be used in lots of Asian American study, because you talk about the identity factor. And the other thing I also recognize is race definitely plays a very important issue, and the whole colonial mentality and the manifest destiny that we talk about, the white superiority. I think because if you look at young Asian American, a lot of them get into Christianity, or they romanticizing getting married in the church. And where did they get the ideas? You know, all this media talk about, you know, they never praise about Buddhism. It's all about Christianity, the beauty of Christianity. And the reason why many young people give up their traditional language or their mother tongue is because English is more important. So I think we have to recognize that force. I don't know how can we eliminate that and make the Asian American feel proud of their culture, because many of them are not proud of their own culture, because Asian culture are secondary, are not considered of superior culture, right? So that's why I asked the question. I say maybe, and Buddhism is such a humble religion to me. You don't see a lot of politics involved, except maybe when we talk about the Dalai Lama, okay? And I think he's not really represent all Buddhism, right? But in general, Buddhism is not, and the church, like the temple and politics is really separate. And you don't hear monk preach about politics as much as pastor or minister. So I was thinking, the millennials are so engaging in social justice and environmental protection. Maybe Buddhism should switch the way of preaching, and because Buddhist practices is really emphasized on environmental protection. Okay, you eating green, you don't kill, you don't, and social justice, right? You have to practice compassion, kindness, and always looking at the positive rather than the negative thing of a person. So that's why I posed the question. Do you think Buddhism could be appealing to this generation, since they are so into environmental protection and social justice and so on?
Thank you for all those reflections, Dr. Ta. I mean, I think the short answer is yes, or else my book would not exist, because no one would have talked to me. Obviously, for them, Buddhism is just a powerful source of spiritual support. But I think you're right that there is something like almost like a reclamation, because there are so many narratives that can make Asian American Buddhists ashamed of their racial identities, of their ethnic identities, the languages they heard in their household growing up, you know, the Buddhist pendant they wear around their neck. So their cultures and their religious cultures. And so I think many of them had to, reclaim that. And I think I'd be really fascinated actually to read a book about Asian American Buddhists who've left Buddhism, and kind of understanding the reasons why they've left, why they haven't stayed in the tradition. I think juxtaposing these two, or people putting all these people in conversation together, we would learn a lot from that.
Okay.
Yeah, that question, Dr. Ta, I think is an excellent one. And specifically sort of asking, I mean, there's a lot going on there, right? This relation between politics and religion. And, you know, in the United States in particular, given our conversation, but also this question of relevance, right? What is relevant? And, you know, I think message is important. You know, I certainly think, you know, I see that among a lot of the white converts, you know, that I talk, you know, I've done work with, is sort of that there is, at least among some of those folks, the importance of the social justice, environmentalism, you know, we could go on, is definitely an appeal in contrast to their experience of Christianity. You know, I talked about my father, for instance, and his conception of religion and power, and trying to create a different space. And I think that's part of the picture. I don't know if it's all of it. You know, you know, one of the interesting stories in my book, one of the folks that actually highlights, focus on one of his an autobiography. He's a second generation Buddhist. He wrote an autobiography, The Silence and the Noise. No one read it. I mean, it basically went out of print immediately. And, you know, in my research for my book, you know, I was also reaching out to all these authors, you know, seeing if they would talk with me and whatnot. And I discovered he's Wiccan now. He's not Buddhist. He doesn't identify as Buddhist anymore. And on one hand, the sort of religious diversity scholar in me wants to say, like, you know, hey, that's great if it's a narrative and a story community that works for him. But there's also part of me that wants to ask that question of, like, what wasn't working in the Buddhist community for him? I mean, he was deeply in culture. I mean, you know, I talk about his story, and he grew up on a Zen Buddhist commune in the Bay Area. That was his life as a child. I mean, he was deeply enculturated in Buddhist life. In a way, actually, most white Buddhists in America certainly aren't. And you know, I think some of it is the message, but the message was there for him. You know, I mean, that community, that Zen community that he talks about, I mean, it's a very social justice oriented community that still exists today. For me, I think it was about community for him, you know, which I think, you know, echoes to some degree what Chenxing is saying. I think this awareness of, like, being very intentional and thoughtful about building these community spaces and relational connections for these folks that sometimes feel really disconnected. You know, whether they're second generation Asian Americans that are struggling to find communities for them, or whether they're second generation white Buddhist Americans that are struggling to find communities for them. You know, I think that relevance of the community, I think, is a huge part of trying to find ways for the, you know, existing Buddhists and existing Buddhist communities to try to find ways of enculturating, supporting, developing those community spaces for different Buddhist communities and different Buddhist individuals.
Okay, thank you. I know we're almost at the close, but I didn't want to leave River Rain's question. So River Rain, do you want to pose your question? And we'll end with that. It's a good question.
Sure, thanks. One thing I had, I'll try to be quick, was hearing a lot last year was about, it was in the Black community, and they were talking about, you know, they have their own epigenetic histories that aren't shared with white Buddhism, where the older white Buddhism we tend to see, and they have their own worldviews and their own experiences and communities. And then they were talking about, you know, starting Black Buddhist movements, and not just BIPOC, but specifically this conversation was about specifically Black Buddhism. And I was like, so when I was hearing this conversation, I was like, yeah, wait, but how does that fit into this two Buddhisms idea? Because this is the third Buddhism. And it's like, what I was going to like, almost like a decolonized white Buddhism at the same time, but it doesn't necessarily connect still with the Asian history. So anyway, just wanted to, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but I don't know if you could add anything to that. Thanks.
The illustrious Gautama, Mahayanists.
So I can say with my book, you know, I write specifically on white second generation Buddhist Americans, but in my research, and actually in my developing ethnographic research, second generation Buddhists are not just white. That actually comes out in Chenxing's book. I mean, many are Asian, but there's actually quite a few that are Black. I've interviewed a couple that are Native American. So there's a wide diversity even within that community. So to your point, I think in my work and going beyond my work, I think being aware and thinking sort of through and supporting stories. I mean, I think one of the themes of Chenxing's and my sort of conversations tonight is really trying to be supportive and developing uplifting spaces for people to share their stories, however they might see them, and share their communities, is just as important outside the sort of two Buddhisms, white, Asian sort of dichotomy, but also in other Buddhist communities as well, and other Buddhist individuals. What that looks like is, I think, a complicated question. I mean, the second generation Black Buddhist Americans that I've interviewed actually share, there's differences in their experience of race and racism, obviously, but there's actually some interesting overlap with a lot of the white subjects I interviewed. You know, one talked about at a conference, and I'm not going to name names, but one talked at a conference where she asked about specifically second generation Black Buddhist Americans, and a very, very famous Black Buddhist American said, "There are those." That was her response. So that kind of dynamic of this question of, you know, convert politics that, you know, I talked about earlier, Chenxing talked about earlier, Jane talked about earlier, you know, that to speak of intersectional politics, there is some permeation that's going on even in Black communities that I think will likely need to be sort of explored and wrestled with in a way that hasn't been done. So I think that's where I'll stop now. I think I've talked enough, but do you have thoughts, Chenxing?
Yeah, we're a little over time, so thanks for everyone who's sticking around. And of course, you know, understand if you need to go to other commitments. Just, yeah, this is, I mean, I think our books are both really blowing up to Buddhism for precisely the reasons you ask the questions that you do. I think by highlighting the incredible diversity that even exists within Asian American Buddhism, within, you know, white American or white convert Buddhism, I've heard from Black Buddhists reading my book that it helps them appreciate that within Black Buddhism, there's also a lot of diversity, even under that kind of umbrella. And I think actually this kind of recognition, what I'd call like a culturally engaged recognition of our differences, becomes a way for us to actually connect in different forms of solidarity. And I think the seeds of this are still feel in some ways young for the Buddhist community, but I see the interest to start connecting, to kind of understand the ways we're racialized differently as Buddhists, but also how white supremacy affects white supremacy affects Buddhism and affects all of us, like regardless of our racial backgrounds, and how we might work to dismantle some of those logics or push back against some of them to alleviate suffering, and for all people, for us to see each other in our differences, in our humanities, to try to learn, right, to try to connect, to really quite simply, I think this is very much at the heart of my book, just to build spiritual friendship together and listen to each other's stories and come from a place of more humility of like, wow, I didn't realize there was this whole group of Buddhists that I just didn't know existed, and I didn't know their stories. And to be able to have spaces where we can learn across these big gulfs of differences that gives me hope that this is starting to happen.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, I just want to highlight Bhante Venerable Dhammapitti asked a very important question. How do I get the book? I put the links in the chat. Chenxing's book, she lists where her book is available at her site. For Drew, there is also a page at Claremont Press where you can buy a copy on Amazon, but you can also read open access. So share that with you if you haven't read these rich contributions already. Thank you both so much. It's been a wonderful experience, enlightening experience, and thinking about through these issues. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.